I'm Emmanuel Ramos.
And this is Emmanuel Ortega, but to avoid confusion, just call me Babelito.
And we are the creators of Unsettling Journeys. Today we have prepared a new kind of video called Decoding Silences. Now, Decoding Silences will serve to complement our other kind of video essays, visual breakdowns, and they will also help us prepare for upcoming videos touching on similar themes, topics, all of those things.
Correct. So today we're going to decode America's first silence. So we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of silences, but also we're going to talk about the legacy of Columbus's landing. This mythical idea of October 12, 1492. Why is it so ingrained in our heads? So we are going to start with this image. What do you think this is?
Well, I know what it is. This is the U.S. Capitol, the Rotunda. And in this gigantic room, you have these magnificent, huge, sublime portraits. So when you're in this space, you can't help but be immersed in the history that's being presented to you.
Right. So as you're drinking the Kool-Aid inside of this room, you focus on this. And why is a painting of Christopher Columbus arriving at the Caribbean in 1492 in the middle of the rotunda? So that's what we're trying to figure it out, to try to understand how the legacy of Latinoamericanos, but also people from the US, is tied to this scene. And this painting is nuts. You have Christopher Columbus, their clothes are pristine, like they have not been itself for voyaging for ages. You have in the background people that are finally touching land. They're scratching the land to find some gold. And then you have his fellow men behind him, backing him up in this like glorious moment, almost like planting the flag onto the soil. And then to the right of the image, you have indigenous peoples. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how we concentrate on some narratives, but we erase others. So let this painting be a guiding principle of how silences of history function.
Exactly. So as we did mention in the last video, we're using Michel-Rolph Truillot's methodology of silences of history. This quote comes from his book, which was published in 1995, just right after 1992, the 500-year commemoration of Christopher Columbus landing. In this period of time, there was a lot of conversations being had about what it meant to celebrate Columbus. And this book really came up with some interesting answers, as we shall see in this quote. Any historical narrative is a particular bundle of silences, the result of a unique process, and the operation required to deconstruct these silences will vary accordingly.
So let me break this down. So Michael Truillot talks about silences kind of like un teléfono descompuesto. How do you say that in English?
Broken telephone?
Yes, it's a game, right? Where you call somebody and supposedly you call somebody and then you repeat that information to the next person and so on and so on and so on. So the farther away you are from that beginning conversation, the less truth there will be to that story. So we can talk about what's happening right here. We are recording a video, and let's say this video gets lost, but somebody heard us recording a video and they write about what we were recording, but they write the wrong information, and then somebody picks up those writings later on 20 years from now and start rewriting all of that. In each single moment of the creation of history, you actually create silences. And those are the things that we're talking about. Those are the things that we're concentrating on. So what about the construction of the narrative of the landing of Christopher Columbus? What are the silences that have been created to this day? How do we go from 1492 all the way to the Rotunda of the United States today? What has been lost? So that's what he means by silences of history.
Precisely. And he continues, fact is itself a narrative of power disguised as innocence.
So Christopher Columbus arrived to the Caribbean October 12, 1492. Quote unquote, a fact. And it's so simple. It's disguised as innocence. But behind that innocent date, there's so much baggage, aka silences of history.
Precisely. There's what we get from this fact is just the idea that this was a moment that was meant to happen, that was bound to happen, that fate and destiny dictated that this moment would happen. And what that happens is that any violences, any context gets lost, and we don't focus on alternative narratives. We don't focus on different people's histories, and instead we focus on the grand discovery of the Americas.
Right. So, for example, when it comes to 1492, surrounding that narrative, we know, for instance, that there were African sailors helping Christopher Columbus. We know that there was a long battle for the Spanish, for the Castilians to take over the Iberian Peninsula, which we talk a little bit about in this video, and we're going to get more into it in the next video. We know that Portuguese sailors also were teaching Columbus how to navigate. So all of that information gets lost. And instead, it's just about that mythical moment from that painting. So the Reconquista, it's an ongoing battle that happened for centuries. But the last final stronghold was taken back to the Spanish.
And what was the Reconquista?
The Reconquista means the reconquest. When the Spanish take the territories of the Iberian Peninsula back from the Muslims. Again, the Iberian Peninsula were under Muslim control for about 800 years. And in between 1491 and 1492, we have the final battle. They call it the Reconquest. That's why when we talk about the invasion of Tenochtitlán, we call it La Conquista de Mexico, because it's all tied to these ideas.
Precisely. And so this narrative leaves us with a lot of silences, but also it has been simplified into a narrative that everybody understands, that everybody knows the history of Columbus. And so the realities of those the reasons for that voyage get lost in between there.
So he wanted to repay his financial backers, especially because a lot of people put a lot of money into this mythical voyage, because it was mythical even before it started. He was part of the Castilian crown who wanted to expand the word of Christ around the world. Christ was coming back. The second coming of Christ was coming back. So they wanted to expand the empire with the word of God. God was going to save them. So that was the main idea of Christopher Columbus, that he wanted to be this religious leader. So again, repay his financial backers, expand the power of the Castilian state, and this will help accelerate the spread of Christianity. And as we mentioned earlier, focusing on this mythical moment is going to erase other narratives. And then he mentions, quote,
this is Truillot, who says, at best, history is about power, a story about those who won.
And we know who won. And here's an image from his first letters, the letters that he writes about what he supposedly saw in the Caribbean. And what do we see in this image?
We see the tools of technology. We see voyages sailing in complex ships.
Barcotes.
We see Christopher Columbus trading with wilderness people. They are not advanced. They live in nature. They are naked. They are afraid. And he is giving them more tools, more technology, and they are repaying him in what seems to be just a plain rock or a fruit.
Right. And this perspective of portraying natives naked, wild, savage, violent, it's very similar to what we saw in a painting. And that painting was from the middle of the 1800s. This is from 1493. Yes, it's from 1493. So this perspectives of this construction of native as such, it's what you get. It's part of this silence. So the silence of history, which was the silence of Christopher Columbus arriving in the Caribbean, created this mythical figure, but also created this quote-unquote little peoples. Here's another image. What do we see on this one? Also from the letters from 1493.
So it's pretty much the same composition. We still see European men in advanced, technologically advanced ships. We see naked people on the other side, being savage in a group, huddled together, naked. And more importantly, in the foreground, we see the image of a European monarch dictating, ruling.
So it's almost like the king from the other side of the world is telling people what to do on the Americas. Again, dress versus naked, the tools of difference, hashtag Kirsten Buick. The tools of difference are shown here. So again, naked versus dress, the technologies of the huts of the Indios, because now they're Indios, are compared to the actual throne of the king, which is constructed like a classical temple. So again, it's about creating myths. It's about creating silences, and it's about amplifying the main narrative, which is the expansion of Christianity, the landing of Christopher Columbus, the saving of all of those souls.
Precisely. It's solidifying those narratives while enforcing silences.
Correct.
And here we have a couple, not all of them, but a few of the papal bulls. These are laws dictated by the Pope himself, who runs the Catholic Church. And as we can see, the first one is from 1455. The second one from 1493. That's just 1 year later after the discovery of the Americas. And the Treaty of Tordesillas. What these three dictates tell us is that the Europeans were in charge of discovering the world first, and then they would get to decide who would get what, which country would get what territory. And what this does more than anything is continue to erase the voice of other people, namely indigenous people.
So because the Pope is a Pope, he's the one who said, you Portuguese people take this, you Spanish people take this part of the Americas, this is the line that is going to divide all of that. It's a mess, but it becomes law. So when you have the writing of Christopher Columbus telling that the other side of the world is filled with this like savage people, then you find justifications for these kinds of actions.
The only solution at that point is to convert them and to take those lands because they have not been able to develop their own societies.
Take, for instance, this document. This is the cover of Historia General de los Hechos Castellanos. This is a book written about the history of Spain, before it was Spain, but it was the Iberian Peninsula from 1625. And if you notice, there's a concentration on the big portraits. It's the king and queen, the Catholic king and queen. We have Christopher Columbus and his son on the bottom. And around that, the narrative of the first 10 years after the quote-unquote discovery from 1492 to, I'm going to say 1502. So with this idea in mind, this mythical discovery of 1492, you're going to read all of those images as fueling that, right? As this heroic, mythical thing that happened. However, because this is how the silences of history work, you're going to erase what we think is the most important thing, which is native resistance. Indigenous people didn't just allow for the quote-unquote conquests to happen. Instead, they resisted and they fought and they fought and they fought. Again,
from the very beginning.
Right, and when I look at these images, when we look at these images, I don't see the conquest of the Caribbean. I see natives resisting the invasion of the Castilians. And again, that erasure, it's everywhere. So instead of concentrating on Christopher Columbus, why hasn't history concentrated, for example, on Anacaona, which was somebody that was hanged by the Spanish for resisting invasion? Or somebody like Haute, who is a leader, for example, it's a hero in Cuba. He traveled from one island to the other to let people know that the invaders were here to stay. But again, because it's all about October 12, 1492, all of these very, very important figures get completely erased from history.
And these are only two narratives. These are only two examples of the many, many, many people who resisted.
Watch Proyecto Panaca. They have an excellent video where they tell you all of the different histories of the first movements of resistance in the first decade of quote-unquote conquest, the 1490s. And then we get to this. This is why we have this history, that it's so successful to this day. This is a monument to Christopher Columbus that was finished in 2011. 2011, this just happened. And this is one of the biggest, most expensive programs of a public sculpture in the Caribbean in 2011. And this is something that keeps happening. Why? Because the legacy of Latinos is tied to this moment. The legacy of people in the US is tied to this mythical moment. Because the mythical moment has been hidden throughout history, that everything else has been erased.
And specifically in the United States, Columbus has played a role in making citizens out of these immigrants. He provided them with a public example of Catholic devotion and civic virtue, and thus a powerful rejoinder to the cliché that allegiance to Rome preempted the Catholics' attachment to the United States.
So in the 19th century, as the US is pushing towards the West, you're going to have the narratives of history are going to change. So, for example, that's why we have those paintings in the rotunda, because they're supposed to heighten ideas of expansion, ideas of empire. This happened to be an Italian immigrant in Spain. So this also gave voice to a lot of Italian immigrants in the United States. So to this day, you have parades like the one you see here in the background in New York that celebrate the legacy of Columbus, and the excuse, I guess, to celebrate that is that it's a celebration of Italian and also Irish immigrants, because Irish immigrants celebrated this date in the 19th century. In fact, just a couple of days before we recorded this video, Governor Cuomo of New York denied that he doesn't want to get rid of the name Columbus in Columbus Circle and the actual statue. And he mentions, quote, "I understand the feelings about Christopher Columbus and some of his acts, which nobody will support," said Cuomo, who is of Italian descent. "But the statues have come to represent and signify appreciation for the Italian-American contribution to New York. For that reason, I support it." I don't support, Unsettling Journeys does not support this statue, because this is precisely a silence of history. Hiding the legacy of one immigrant group is by way of erasing the pain and suffering of millions and millions of people. Because what Christopher Columbus did is he started a period of extermination. So for that simple reason, we should not celebrate him. We should talk about him, but not celebrate him with these kinds of statue. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the legacy of Christopher Columbus's landing.
Make sure you stay tuned and that you subscribe in order to keep learning about this. We have more upcoming videos that go into depth, that show more images and examples of everything that we just talked about. So remember, stay tuned if you want to keep on learning the history of Mestizaje in Latin America and the United States.
Bye.